Hello and welcome to a pro basketball show with me, Andrew Willett. We're in the midst of WNBA coverage and excited to bring our content to you. You can catch a pro basketball show on streaming services such as YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify with live broadcasts on playback. Make sure to follow us at APBShow on social media platforms such as Twitter and Instagram, with more coming soon. Without further ado, a pro basketball show. Hello and welcome to a pro basketball show. We are getting set and ready for the WNBA season, and for that, we're going to talk today about one of the league's premier teams, an instant title contender thanks to a stunningly brilliant offseason. That's the New York Liberty, and to do some of that and just to gape at some of the additions to the already talented New York Liberty roster, welcome to the show. This is Myles Ehrlich, a senior writer over at Winsider, Liberty expert covering the beat, one of my favorite WNBA Twitter follows, and also the co-host of the Pull Up with Myles and Owen podcast. Myles, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing?
Thanks so much, Andrew. I'm doing well, and thank you for that intro. That's really nice.
Seriously, I've been watching the W the last 3-4 years, and just being able to see what you're putting out there, follow your Twitter account, great stuff. But ever since last season, what's your life been like since the Las Vegas Aces were crowned champions?
Sure, yeah. So last year was the first time I think I really fully dove into the college season. It's just been so overwhelming. So normally I'm doing some prep to try to figure out where the Liberty are going to land and which picks they're going to have, and then try to work backwards there. But I decided to go fully into the deep end this time. And it made it a little bit harder to cover Euro because the Liberty have so many people overseas, or in Australia. There are a bunch of people there too. But luckily those WNBL games are normally on at 3 a.m, so I can still make those work. But yeah, the college game was something that I really shifted a lot of focus to. And like you mentioned, the podcast, Owen Pence and I started the podcast in January or February. It was our first episode. So we were teaching myself how to do what you're doing, how to edit, how to put a pod together. Has been a lot of work, but it's been really fulfilling.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've actually recently started tuning into that as well. I'm excited how that's going. Like you said, we're getting going over here at a pro basketball show. But obviously, as we start to dive into the Liberty, And it's ironic that you said that this was the first year you've really gotten into women's college basketball, and then the Liberty, they go and do all of that. But how are you feeling right now about the New York Liberty?
Well, I will say that it was really nice to attend and cover the draft this year without needing to write something by the next morning, because the Liberty, like you said, they had 1 third-round pick that was a draft and stash. So I was able to go there knowing I was without a deadline, and that was really, really nice. So I could just kind of get into it. But yeah, I'm kind of floored still. And I thought that would go away at the start of training camp, but it just happens that Stewie and JJ are on this return to play. So they're not really practicing. And then Sloot got a little bit banged up the first day. So it still doesn't look like a very different team that I've been watching. And I thought that training camp was where it was going to hit me, that this is brand new and this is a super team. But it's mostly the same players that I've been watching in the last couple of years, minus a couple that have moved on to make room for this team. So yeah, I'm just excited about kind of what the potential is, but in my mind, it's still so much potential.
Yes, I bet. And it's kind of interesting where you haven't really been able to gel into a new roster. Let's get right into that. Because this is a team that loses a lot of players who were on the roster last year. Rebecca Allen, Sammy Whitcomb, Crystal Dangerfield, Natasha Howard, obviously, Michaela Aniwede, and they add the talent that we just talked about in Courtney Vandersloot, Brianna Stewart, Jonquel Jones, Taylor Thornton, another big piece added, as well as a slew of other players to the training camp roster. And I guess before we get into all of that, I do want to take a step back here, Myles, and talk about last season, where this New York Liberty team finishes the year 16-20. they are able to snag a playoff spot, get that seventh spot, and they go and win a playoff game, bring some basketball to the Barclays Center, postseason basketball, that is. But this is a team that finished ninth last year in offensive rating, 12th in defensive rating. What were your takeaways from last season?
It's all, and I think that you see this across the league. It's all about instilling a culture because it is the hardest professional sports league to make a roster. There are 144 spots, but then once you start to take out the teams that are up against the cap, it's really more like 135 or so. And it's just really unforgiving. So the game is in the margins. That's how closely it can be. You're the 7 seed, you're the 9 seed, you're the 11 seed. It's that close. And I think we're going to see that a lot this year. Maybe not at the very top, but for me, teams 4 through 12, 5 through 12 are all kind of interchangeable right now. So I'm very interested. And a lot of that's going to be chemistry. And the Liberty went through their growing pains last year. So even though those 3 players, the big 3 that they've added have been out for a majority of camp, what's different is last year was a brand new coaching staff. That was Sandy Brondello coming in. And a lot of people didn't realize just how banged up they were in training camp last year. And they were supposed to have one preseason game, which was against the Washington Mystics, that they had to cancel because they only had 6 active players. So they couldn't even run. They could barely run a 5-on-5 against practice players last year, which was luckily for them the first time they were allowed back since before COVID, because otherwise they would have been running 3-on-3 drills, or they would have had assistant coaches up. So when they come out last year, they win the first game improbably over the Connecticut Sun. And everyone's like, wow, this is the new look Liberty, and then rattle off 7 losses in a row and it makes sense, right? It's a new staff. It's people coming in from overseas. Becca was late to report. Natasha Howard had a full practice, had a full training camp for the first time in her career. So she kind of was gelling a little bit. But Dee Dee and Mick had nagging injuries. Same thing with Joss. And it's just a lot of these pieces. And then they bring in Crystal Dangerfield, and that helps them move Sabrina to the 2 and kind of right the ship a little bit. So it was a roller coaster. But through that adversity, that's how you build a team that can overcome a lot of obstacles. And I think that's how you instill that culture. And that's what sets them up for making all of those moves this year. Is teams and players on these other teams are picking up on that. They're seeing the continuity. They're seeing that kind of kinship that's happening. And they're talking to players that have come here in free agency the last couple of years. You look at from the 2020 year when they were 2-20, they bringing in Benaj Eleni and Natasha Howard after that season, and Sammy Whitcomb. And then last year they made the bigger splash they had the splash of bringing in Steph Dolson, and Steph was instrumental in having played with both Stewie and Sloot, both in college and then in the pros, in getting them over here. So you're seeing a gradual climb. Like, none of this happened overnight. And Jonathan Kolb talked about having Jonquel Jones's jersey in his office for a year because he was so committed, because he thought there was a chance last year. Obviously, it was well documented, the Stewie conversations that happened last offseason. So none of this just happened. And I think the 2022 season was pretty emblematic of taking that next step.
That's really interesting because the way I view it on a very outside level, it was so far and that season, you mentioned the injuries, but it was a little disappointing to bring in Sandy Brondello, excuse me, and have a season that wasn't maybe as high as their potential was. But like you said, kind of stepping stones, and they did into this offseason, and they get to skip a lot of those steps, it kind of appears, because the talent is just coming. They made the one trade for Jonquel Jones, which is, we'll talk about that here in a moment, but the talent just comes all the way through. It was a no-brainer to make all of those moves.
Yeah, that doesn't make it easy. I do not envy Jonathan Kolb having to, because he's someone who really the players get along with as well. And he always says that every one of those players that is on the way out, first of all, is a person before they're a player, of course, but that they were instrumental to getting the franchise to this point and to bringing them back into relevance, because like I said, 2020 is not that long ago, and 2-20 that year, and that was coming off of having Sabrina as the number one overall pick. And to make all of that growth, all of this potential does not happen without all of the players that are no longer with them here.
And I mentioned the stepping steps. It is a part of the process. And I'm curious if you think like it at some point that does make them a little bit less likable as a team. I know lots of fans like to enjoy a team if it's homegrown, it's built from the ground up, and they take all of those steps. They did to step those steps. You mentioned even those little steps are still important to getting them where they are right now.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that these are really high character people that they're bringing in. Jonquel Jones, there was the incredible ESPN cover story by Katie Barnes last year about JJ and just how undercovered she is and how she should be talked about more. And a couple of years ago, while covering the Liberty beat for a couple of outlets, I was also covering the Sun for Winsider at the time, and I got to talk to JJ, and that was a very different environment because if they went out west, there'd be some times where I was one of two reporters that was on the Zoom at midnight. And from the first day, JJ was so warm and so just like casually cool in that she was very welcoming and very appreciative of the coverage. And I was kind of taken aback because I had just watched her on the court, and she's a dog on the court, right? She's amazing and she's incredible. Um, but you talk to her for 5 minutes and it's like you've been friends for a year. And it was just a moment where I was like, how is she not plastered everywhere? And there are larger issues, a lot of racial issues that are kind of behind that as well. But she's not going to be coming onto this team and saying like, this is my squad and now everyone else has to get out of the way. Similarly, Stewie takes every opportunity possible to talk about how the league could be better for everybody, not just for the players at the top, but kind of trickle down, and is while being one of the best 2 or 3 basketball players in the women's game in the world, she's also constantly fighting for everybody else. Kayla Thornton is going to work harder than anybody else on the court, and that's just part of that culture. And she's already fit in seamlessly when you're putting her onto a court with like Benai Laney and Dee Dee Richards and Jocelyn Willoughby, players that have that kind of energy. And then Sloot also just consummate professional, and is one of those players where it's really hard to get her not to play for a couple of days because she just wants to talk hoops. And at media day the other day, she played with an assistant coach, Olaf Lang, back in Chicago. And she called, and Olaf told the story how she called when she was kind of far along in the decision-making process. And it wasn't a conversation about what's New York's culture like as a city and like what am I going to eat, where am I going to stay. It wasn't about any of that. It was about the basketball. She wanted to understand the system and understand how they would use her and what the fit would be. And so when you see all of those pieces coming in there, it's not like that's going to overwhelm what already exists, but instead be complementary. And I think that that's kind of shown through in training camp also. The first day I was there, it was Sabrina and Benijah breaking down the huddle at the end of practice. And the next day, it was Niara Sabali and Dee Dee Richards. The next day, Han Shu and Sika Kone. So Sandy's kind of spreading that love, but it's starting with these like young vets that have been there and understand, because Sandy Brondello also has a kind of complex offensive system. So I think that also, it shows that the players that already have that familiarity are the ones that are going to be leading the way for the new players, especially if a lot of them have been sidelined. But it's created this kind of weird dynamic where everyone is bringing their own different leadership qualities to the table, because while these players that were already on the Liberty have the experience with Sandy, they might not have the experience winning a championship, a lot of them. So there's that balance as well. And it doesn't feel at all competitive, but it feels collaborative.
I love that. And honestly, that's so important, I think, and undervalued in a lot of spaces is how much collaboration could really be more beneficial than competition. And that's interesting that they're bringing that to camp. And Myles, this is why we have you on this podcast, because that was so much knowledge that you aren't going to find anywhere else. But let's try and break down this offseason step by step. First, the Jonquel Jones trade. They bring in her as well as Taylor Thornton for a 23 first round pick, Natasha Howard and Crystal Dangerfield. I guess my question is, how on earth do they pull that off? Because Jonquel Jones, MVP just a couple of seasons ago.
Yeah, and also Beck Allen went over to Connecticut. It was a three-teamer, but yeah, when you have the opportunity to get a player like Jonquel Jones, you have to pull the trigger on that deal. And I know that there are some difficult components to it. Natasha Howard was the defensive anchor for this team last season, and also that was the idea back in 2021. And almost like when you talk about Benai Delaney, when you talk about Sammy Whitcomb and Beck Allen, these are players that wanted to invest in the growth of the Liberty and kind of pull them out of tough times. Beck was the longest reigning player. She plays for Sandy Brondello on the Australian Opals, so that couldn't have been an easy deal to make in that respect also. And like I said earlier, Crystal Dangerfield basically helped turn the season around by giving them something they did not have on the roster in this selfless point guard play and in really dynamic defense. And just she's just such a hardworking and such a smart player that they needed that burst of energy. So while it's easy to look at the balance sheet and say what you're getting is someone who won the MVP 2 years ago, what you're giving up is also it's not insignificant. And a large part of that culture that we were kind of talking about. But what that trade, for me anyway, did more than anything else is it made the offseason a success, regardless of what happened with the Stewie sweepstakes. Because going into the offseason, it was basically Stewie or bust, right? It was like, this is the ceiling of this Liberty team. What we saw last year, maybe they'll get a little bit better if they've got some continuity. Maybe they'll get to the second round, but they're not a championship caliber team. But then you bring in Jonquel Jones in this deal, and all of a sudden you've got a superstar headlining your roster. And that made it, it's not to say they didn't need Stewie, they didn't need Sloot, but if Brianna Stewart had chosen to go back to Seattle, you can say, are we better than we were at the end of last year? And the answer was yes. So I think that was really important. And I think that KT also offsets losing a player who's as dynamic as Beck Allen on the defensive end, because there just are not that many wings in this league that can do what the two of them are capable of doing. And I think every championship roster needs a player like that. And it just happens that the Liberty have several players like that, because I think Benai Delaney doesn't get enough credit for her wing defense because of just how great she is offensively also, and how strong she is at scoring the ball and how great of a leader she is, that I think sometimes her defense will get overlooked. But they have her, they've got KT, they have the versatility of, as of now anyway, of Dee Dee Richards, of Jocelyn Willoughby. So that all of that combined, that's what you need. Those are the pieces you need. Obviously you've got the headliners, but it's like watching a movie, right? If you've just got a couple of stars up top, but then everything else is just trash behind it, like you're only going to go so far. And I think that's the same case with this roster. And it's this depth that could be the separator for them.
Interesting. And they made this Jonquel Jones trade, and you mentioned everything else that comes, but they do this trade knowing that they're still going to be trying for Brianna Stewart. I think that takes a lot of courage to go and make that move, considering where I'm still not certain of the fit. How do you feel about the fit after they made the trade for Jonquel Jones, then go to Bree Stewart as well as Courtney Vandersloot?
So I think that the other, at the time we talked about it, but now it's kind of forgotten. But the other big part of that deal was that the Liberty ended up opening up a good amount of cap space in that deal. So they acquired JJ, and then they also acquired room to not just sign Stewie, but also to sign Sloot, with both of them willing to take a little bit less money. But they didn't have to be sign and trade deals, which meant that they were able to keep this depth that the team had built. So I think that that's a big part of it. In terms of the fit, the three of them played together in Russia, um, on UMMC for a couple of seasons, in terms of Stewie and Sloot and JJ. And then just right now, Stewie and Sloot are coming over from playing in Turkey together this offseason. Um, Benija and Sabrina have played with Stewie on the Team USA roster. So this starting five, there's already been a lot of crossover.
Mm.
Like I said, Steph has played with a couple of them. So it's not just kind of this random disparate parts kind of thing, but there is film that's showing how it works. But the big thing that I think is we saw last year how dynamic it was for Sabrina to play off the ball. And Courtney Vandersloot allows that to happen. The spacing, because it goes past just the bigs that are in the starting lineup. It goes past just JJ and Stewie, but Hanshu, Steph Dolson's a 40% three-point shooter. All of their bigs can shoot also. And that just opens up so much space for everybody to operate. And that's something I've been seeing in camp a lot, is a lot of weak side cuts just kind of filling the open spaces, because they basically could play five out if they want to, or they could take turns and put JJ in the low post, or bring Stewie over into a high pick and roll and have room to kind of navigate that. They could get Sabrina off ball into some actions and have her with that room and space to make things happen. So there are just so many possibilities. And I think that goes back to the culture conversation, right? About this being kind of a selfless team. There's no one on this roster that's going to think, I need to get mine tonight. And it's just going to happen a lot. It's going to happen a lot of it organically on the offensive end. So they're right now not worried about their offense. I don't know if I've ever heard a team enter camp saying that our offense is going to come, but they're determined to make themselves, their identity, a defensive one. And
Mm.
I think in knowing that, and that's part of having the championship experience, is those players coming in and saying, it doesn't matter how many points we can score if we can't stop anybody. And we know we can kind of get some on that end, but to keep ourselves humble and to keep ourselves fighting, we need to make sure that all of our energy is going into that defensive intensity.
That's and I was coming into this season thinking the New York Liberty. I think offensively it could take maybe some time to gel into each other, trying to get the system. But defensively, I thought this could be a crew with Jonquel Jones anchoring the paint, and Brianna Stewart, a phenomenal defender. That could be really good right away defensively, and I like that they're focusing on that early on. As we start to look at this roster, I'm curious who you see as, or is there a clear-cut starting lineup right away? And do you think that's the same as the closing lineup, the kind of the best lineup for this squad?
Yeah, well, I think that the starting lineup, it's hard to go away from the five all-star lineup where you've got the three players that came in, JJ, Stewie, and Sloot, and then you add Benija Laney, who was an all-star 2 years ago before getting injured last year, and Sabrina, who made her first all-star game last year. So I think that that's your starting five. What we saw towards the end of last year, and it's going to take a while before Maureen Johannes gets over this year, but we saw her in a lot of those closing lineups last year. So that's a possibility. If you're looking for a more defensive lineup, Kayla Thornton can play and defend 1 through 4. So I could see her, if you want to sub out Sab or Sloot, and just get some more defensive intensity in there and control the pace a little bit, I could see one of them kind of sub in offense defense. And I think that just goes to show the flexibility of some of the depth is a strength. They know that that's going to be a big strength for them, and that's while they're also going to have at the end of the roster developing somebody like Anyara Sabali or a Sika Kone, depending on how this next week goes. So they're not forfeiting the future, but they're going to have so many options. And Hanshu is also, I think she's 23 now. So she's still very young as well. It's her third season in the league. She grew another inch. She's 6'11 now. And she's just hitting every shot in camp. And it was pretty telling that she came into media day saying, I looked at some of my stat lines last year, and there were games where I didn't get a rebound. And she's like, how can you play the center position without getting a rebound or without getting a block? And I think that's just kind of showing that trickle down. It's a top down kind of mentality about I need to be out here and not just get my points, but kind of do a little bit of everything. So the lineup could change based on, some foul trouble or based on game flow. But I think I'd feel safe saying I know what the starting five is going to be. And the closing five could evolve game to game.
And I'm so glad that you are also saying Benaj Delaney. I've seen her like somewhat being forgotten through the talks, and like you said, that's a 5 all-star lineup with her. She's really good. I'm a big fan of her game, so I like that in the lineup. And like you said, there's so much depth on this team. You go from the very top. It's Sabrina, Sloot, Benija, Stewie, JJ, Kayla Thornton, Maureen Johannes, Stephanie Dolson, Hanshu. And that's just the start of like there are several other players. Dee Richards, Jocelyn Willoughby played a lot of minutes last year, as well as Epiphany Prince being brought in, and that's
Mm-hmm.
I think I've named 12 players already. Who do
Yeah.
you think could be some surprise cuts at the end of this roster?
Well, that's the problem. That there are going to have to be some tough decisions made. I Well, first of all, I did want to say that I'm glad that you talked about how important B is, because and how she sometimes gets glossed over in the conversation at large. I will tell you that in that huddle, nobody is forgetting who she is. She is the leader. She is like the far and away leader on this team. And she just sets the tone for everything and just kind of embodies everything that New York is about. So I thought it's important to call that out. There are a couple of camp battles that I've been watching closely. I think that it's tough because you also have to keep the CBA in mind. And Jocelyn Willoughby, for example, signed last year a 4th-year rookie extension, which largely protects her from being cut. But Dee going into last year, the idea was to bring her along as the backup point guard, and then she got hurt, had a hamstring injury in camp, and everything was kind of set back from there. But if that's the goal here, you're looking at her and Piff, and Epiphany Prince is such a veteran and New York City legend. I went to high school at the same time she did in New York City, and I remember her 113-point game. So I've known about Piff's game and followed her game for a very long time. Um, but the two of them could be looking at that backup one position. And then it's Niara Sabali and Sika Kone that are in a camp battle. And both of them were draft picks last year. Niara was the number 5 overall, missed the season because she had a leg injury that she was rehabbing from. And then Sika Kone was left overseas as a draft and stash. She was a 3rd-round pick last year, but really showed out for Mali in the FIBA games. And she's come over and just been electric. She's an athlete, she's energetic, and she's kind of everywhere. And it's the coaches have kind of joked about they need to rein her in sometimes. But I did not know going into camp which of those two, if there's a spot for just one, I didn't know which of those would jump out to me. And based on everything that I've seen, from everything I've heard from the coaching staff and everything that I've seen myself, Niara does not play like a rookie at all. And I think part of that might be because she was an assistant coach with Sacramento State during this year where she was off. And she talked about her appreciation for coaches and the amount of time that went in. But from the first day I was in camp, I saw her teaching other players nuances on the court in terms of what the play design they were running. I saw her helping Sika out and talking to a couple of the other younger players, talking to Han. And I think that the coaching staff has noticed that as well, that she's not out there. And I think it's given her a leg up. And she's just got kind of a nose for the ball. She's almost every day. And I know this is against practice players, so it might not play it the same way. But just seems to always be fighting on the glass for an offensive rebound and doing a lot of the little things and just being really smart with her footwork. So despite how really it would be such a tough cut if it wasn't Sika, if Sika had to go to waivers, but because her skill set is just very unique in terms of just her athleticism and just like her drive is not something that you see in a gym very often. Um, but I think she might still be a year away. So yeah, I think I'd give the edge there to Niara, but it's tough. And I'm so glad that I don't have to make those decisions.
No doubt. And Miles, again, that is a great intel because you just tell the story on each of these players. It's going to be really tough for the Liberty and Sandy Brandela to make these moves because I mean it's a loaded roster already, and we're talking about a top five pick from last year potentially being there down the stretch. Hopefully that works out for Niara, but let's move on real fast because I'm curious um, about the cuts because I'm looking at the guard spot. It looks really good with Courtney Vandersloot and Sabrina Ionescu. And then the bid spot as well. You mentioned Han Shu and Stephanie Dolson. That's backing up the two MVPs in Jonquel Jones and Brianna Stewart. The win spot, I'm a little curious about, and in terms of depth as well. If they do end up making cuts, do they consider maybe keeping more wins once they do get to cuts, or how do you feel about kind of the roster makeup?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that question of versatility, right? That you have players that can guard multiple positions, and that's something that will give a leg up to players like Kayla Thornton, to players like Jocelyn Willoughby, Dee Dee Richards. They have the ability and are excited about kind of any defensive matchup that you throw their way. So I wouldn't be super worried because outside of Benijah, Kayla is a great shooter and slasher as well. But Dee Dee and Joss are willing to they've kind of learned that to stay on a W roster, you are just going to do whatever you need. And I asked them about that at media day, and they both said like that was an adjustment for them because of injuries. Because I asked them about like Sandy Brandela preaches versatility. How do you stay within yourself and like day to day because you don't have a defined role. You don't know what you're going to be asked to do. And they both said it was difficult. It's tough, but what you can always do is play defense. And Dee Dee said that it's one of the largest things that she's struggled with because she said Sandy says, okay, I'm going to need you to play 1 through 4. Just go out there and do it. And she's like, I need more than that. Like, tell me, I need more than that. But she said she's learned how to watch the game and get a feel for it to know when she goes in there, what she's going to need to do. And, there's little stuff like she's worked on her ball handling this year because she thinks she'll be playing more in the one. And she's looked a lot more decisive, especially driving and getting to the mid range. I think there were some times where she got towards the rim and she's able to get there and didn't quite know what she did with it, what to do with it at that point. But I've seen a couple of jump stop mid range shots or really confident finishes at the basket. But yeah, in terms of them as just wing players, I think that's probably where they're most comfortable. And can be low usage players in a lineup where there already are so many scoring options. So I think they'll be okay there. I think if they go in there and they just say, we are going to make our priority adding to this team defensively, boxing out, grabbing rebounds, and pushing in transition, and not, I need to take one shot and make sure it goes in or I'm going to hit the bench. There are enough players who can take and make shots. So I think in that respect, the Liberty have a lot of good options.
Couldn't agree more. Miles, before we get to the fun ones real fast, I was curious, are you concerned about potentially any weaknesses on this team? What are you most excited about on this team?
It's weird, but I mean, outside of health, because that's always going to be something that you have to worry about, and you track back to in any sport, right? And you look at the injury luck for most of the teams, either they get healthy at the right time or they stay abnormally healthy throughout the season, like we saw with the Aces last year. That's always going to be a concern. I'm a little bit worried about the perimeter defense for the starters, maybe that Sabrina Sloot backcourt, especially not getting so many reps together. I think it'll take a little while to gel. And I think it's not a bad thing that they opened the season against the Washington Mystics, who are just a just a defensive menace, and they have size inside, but also have like maybe the best grouping of defensive guards with Natasha Cloud, Ariel Atkins, and now Brittany Sykes, and the three of them together. So that's going to be it's either the Liberty come out and don't have a lot of reps together and they come out and they look great because they are this super team, or it's like, okay, that here's where we are and here's where we need to get to be in seeing that defensive intensity. Something that was really promising though was Christina Williams was talking to Sabrina Ionescu about her offseason, and this is the first healthy offseason Sab has had. And she said, from the last day of the season, I was able to start working out immediately and worked a lot on lateral quickness. And the idea behind that is partially beating people off the dribble, but also defensively. She's not a poor defender. I think that there are sometimes players that you'll watch that just don't put in effort, and Sabrina's always putting in that effort. She doesn't have the most foot speed. So I think recognizing that weakness in her game and actively trying to work on it this offseason, it shows leadership, it shows maturity, but it also shows that she can look at this roster and say, okay, I don't want to be the weak link on defense. And with that kind of mentality, it's helps me a little bit with that concern. And also, yeah, having JJ and Stewie behind you at the second level will also keep people honest. So, I think I'm kind of nitpicking if I'm looking for some weaknesses here.
That's fair. And yeah, with the trees back there to protect the rim, I think that should help as well, like you mentioned. Now we're gonna do kind of a quick rapid fire, some fun predictions for this team specifically, going through some awards. Myles, you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. First, win-loss prediction. Any thoughts on how good this team could be?
So yeah, I said, it's a 40-game season also for the first time. I think they hit 30 wins. I think 30 and 10 is a good range. Because I think, like I said, 4 through 12 can probably beat up on each other any given night. And there's just talent everywhere. So they're not going to go in and go 38 and 2 or something like that. So I think, yeah, 30 and 10 is a good range.
That is a solid season. That would be a really impressive mark. Myles, the MVP of the Liberty. Who do you like?
I like Benijah Laney for the reasons we talked about earlier. Leadership, she's the continuity, she's the heart, and is in that perfect sweet spot entering her prime where she can relate to the young players, but also to the veterans, and has just proven it so much where she was from being waived right before the 2020 season by the Fever to then being most improved to then being an all-star. She wants it. She's hungry for it. And at Media Day the other day, she was paired with Steph Dolson, and she said, Steph has a championship. I don't. I want one of those. Like, I'm coming for that. So I think that her mindset is going to fuel the whole team, and in my eyes, that makes her the MVP.
Yeah, you've got to love that mentality in sports, especially. And so, Benijah Laney, I like the pick. I'm kind of surprised though you didn't go with Brianna Stewart or John Paul Jones, one of the new faces.
Yeah, I mean, they're going to be great, and I think don't be surprised if it takes them a little bit of time to just gel. So it's about finding, and I don't necessarily think that the highest scorer on the team is going to be the most important. And I think that it's just B's two-way ability it just kind of uniquely positions her, and her voice. If she last year when she wasn't healthy, she was at times felt like one of the most important people on the roster because you could just see her talking everybody up at timeouts, and it's hard to take her off the floor. So she's going to, once again, because she keeps on having these new expectations set for her, and she is going to once again crash past them and excel.
And up next is the most improved player on the Liberty. I look at it and I see like Taylor Thornton has some potential there as I guess someone who could play a huge role for this team. But who do you like for that award on this team?
Yeah, I'm of two minds here because there are two very separate avenues of improvement. On one end, I will say Sabrina Ionescu's efficiency is going to shoot up. Think about last year, we were watching the All-Star game, and I think Sab ended up taking like just 8 shots or something like that, but 6 of them were wide open threes. That's what it's going to look like on a nightly basis. She's going to find herself open all the time, and with playing off the ball, but then also having some of this pick and roll action, and just the gravity that's going to be drawn away by so many of these other players will just help her just take her game to another level. So in terms of efficiency, I don't think her individual numbers in terms of counting stats will be as high, but in terms of her effectiveness, I think that'll be higher. But if you're looking for who's going to make the biggest impact, 5 days of camp, and I don't think, and I tweeted this the other day, I don't think I saw Han Shu miss a shot. And that's her stretching out. I don't know if I saw her touch the rim in terms of her shooting. I know she can get up there and touch it herself. But in terms of her shots, it's just her form is consistent, and I guess she's shooting down on the rim almost, so maybe that's part of it. But her range is limitless, and she's just so much more comfortable. And I asked Olaf Lang about that the other day, and he said that a lot of that is just due to confidence. It's due to her knowing the system a little bit, and it's due to her having another year here. She answered all of the questions at Media Day in English, which was a huge improvement over last year, just to show how comfortable she is. And on the beat, I was lucky enough to talk to Han a good amount last year, and she would try to answer some questions one-on-one, but being in front of a room full of media, she was like, nope, I don't want any part of that. So I think seeing that off-court confidence kind of translate to on-court confidence will just see her in better position. So yeah, 2 very different reasons, but I think that Sab and Han are my options there.
And I would also be interested in seeing them run a lot of pitch and roll
Mm-hmm.
in the second quarter or something throughout the
Pick and
season.
pop, yeah.
Oh yeah, big fan of that. Up next, sixth player of the year. We've talked about all the depth, the loaded bench. Who do you like for that award?
KT. Kayla Thornton is a very good shooter, but what she's there for is her wing defense, like we talked about already. And she looks like she has been in this system for 5 or 6 years already, just with how loud she is when she's talking on defense, her diving after loose balls in practice. Like, she is not one of the players who's fighting for a roster spot, but she's out there like she is. And that just sets the tone for everybody else. And that's exactly what the second unit needs, right? They need to be coming onto the floor and maintaining whatever momentum the starters have generated, and then to keep that energy up until the first unit comes back in. And I think that is all going to start with KT.
Up next, defensive player of the year for this squad.
That's tough, because it's almost like who's the most impactful defender. But I think I'm going to go Stewie here. I think Stewie, her help side defense we've seen is really, really effective. And we saw it with Natasha Howard when they were together in Seattle. So having that help for not just for JJ, right? When she needs help on the weak side, if she has to jump out and help on something, but also, like we said earlier, for the guards, she can be everywhere, and her wingspan is just otherworldly. So she gets to a lot of shots that people wouldn't otherwise, and then can immediately turn it into points the other way.
The infamous wingspan, and she is a defensive player of the year candidate every year, it seems like. So I like that pitch as well. Lastly, and I open it up to newcomer of the year exactly for times like this, but rookie/newcomer of the year. I don't know if not many rookies will make the roster. So who do you like for that award?
Yeah. So newcomer, and that involves everyone coming over in free agency or trades as well.
I suppose it does. Yes.
Then I think that we haven't talked about JJ enough, and it's going to be her. Unfortunately, for whichever rookies or newcomers at the end of the bench, I don't think they're going to have much run this year, just because this is a team that has such lofty championship goals, and Sandy Brondello historically doesn't play too deep into the bench. So I think that'll take out your Niara Sablis and that kind of, or your Yasika Kones, whoever's down there at the end of the roster. But JJ is going to do a lot of stuff out there that she doesn't get credit for. She's going to draw so much attention and open up the floor in a way that not a lot of people can. And she loves taking that trail three, and that's going to become a really like important part of the Liberty offense this year. So it's going to be kind of in the margins, right? She might not always have the 20 and 15 games, but her impact every time she's there, if you anchor her in the low post, everyone else is going to have some daylight to get shots off. So yeah, I'll put her down for that category.
I love it. I love it. Lastly, some fun ones, superlatives. First one being the unsung hero, and we've got a lot of options.
Yeah, well, man, maybe that would have been better for JJ, right? Just drawing all of that attention. Unsung heroes, Jocelyn Willoughby. She has been an unsung hero, I think, in the last couple of years, and not just in terms of what's happening on the court, but her just steadiness and her level-headedness. I think back to her rookie season when she started a book club, and I went to a bunch of those, and it was just with Liberty fans. And then there was another time last year where she was talking to a college class of journalists, that aspiring journalists, and Joss is who the team puts forward when they just like need someone who is there to bring in the community and to really like get deep into the New York experience. And I think for that, just having that on your roster, you can't really overstate the importance when you're looking at still continuing to grow a league, to grow the next generation of hoopers, and to just have more exposure, positive exposure. I think Joss is the perfect person for that.
Up next, class clown.
That's Dee Dee. I don't know if I need to give you a long answer there. Um, 3 to 5 times a day at practice, she's saying something that is making me laugh, and it's just so effortless. And she's just, between her mannerisms and the things that she says, it's just Dee Dee's hilarious. And it's not like she's a joke teller. She's not. She's just, her support and her wit and her just like the quickness with which she's going to have a quip, and the energy, all of it, none of it ever feels malicious. It's always from a place of support. So she's the class clown, but she's not getting on like the coaching staff's nerves at all. They're encouraging that. Though I think we're gonna see her struggle a little bit with this new rule about celebrating on the sidelines.
I know. I saw that. We'll talk about that another day. But yeah, I love DG Richards for that. Okay, and I'm hoping, gosh, every single one of these players have to make the roster because the all so talented and deserving. And anyway, last one here, the best trash talker on the team.
Mm. You know, it might be Sabrina. I think Sabrina might be the loudest trash talker. I don't know if she's the best. Steph can also give it a little bit. But yeah, it's probably between those two in terms of what I've seen. So much of it, though, is kind of good natured, and JJ can get into a little bit too. But yeah, I think I'll go Sab on that one.
Okay, okay. Myles, thank you so much for joining our show. I feel like I could have asked you about the Liberty for another hour or so. But anything else, any other takes as the 2023 season about to get underway, especially for the New York Liberty with the amount of talent that they have brought in and they have on this roster?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just so ready for the season to start already. It feels like, the anticipation for free agency was so great, and then this roster is built, and now we're just in this seemingly endless waiting period. But yeah, the W is around the corner, and I just can't wait to cover it. And I'm very lucky for this team to be in my borough, in my city, and that I get to cover them.
Absolutely. And I think lastly here, as we talked about an end goal for this team, I think they're obviously championship. Beyond obvious that they are championship contenders, but I think they have the talent in place to be so for a long, long time. So excited for this team. Excited to see them grow together from just getting started here soon this season. And Myles, best of luck this season. First, can you tell everyone where they can find your stuff?
Sure. So I'm at Myles Ehrlich on Twitter, MyleseHRlich. And there I will be live tweeting a lot of press conferences or sharing articles that I've written. I'm writing primarily for Winsidr, WINSIDR. And like Andrew mentioned at the top, I also recently started a podcast, which is going to not just cover the Liberty, although we had a Liberty player on already in Kayla Thornton, and we had the director of a documentary about the Liberty, Allison Clayman, on last week. And we've got another player coming up soon, but it's going to actually branch out and cover all 12 teams once we hear back from a couple of things we've got moving. And that's Pull Up with Myles and Owen. And we're going to try to get those out weekly once the season starts. So yeah, that's mostly what I've got to plug. And at the Winsidr Patreon, I've also been writing training camp observations every day and just kind of giving you 1,000 words or so on what I'm seeing and breaking down what's happening behind closed doors.
I love it. I love it. Myles, thank you so much for coming on to talk Liberty. Excited for their season. Yeah, thank you for joining the Pro Basketball Show today.
Of course. Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Thank you so much for tuning into a Pro Basketball Show. You can catch a Pro Basketball Show on streaming services such as YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify with live broadcasts on playback. Make sure to follow us at APBShow on social media platforms such as Twitter and Instagram, with more coming soon. Until next time, I am Andrew Willett. Thank you for tuning in.